November 23, 1943. Japanese Naval Intelligence Headquarters, Rabaul, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Nakamura pressed his palms against his temples as the recording played for the 37th time. The static-laden voice crackled through the speakers, American frequencies, American equipment, but words that belonged to no language his team of 12 cryptographers could identify. Beshlo, Dahetihi, Neazja. The sounds rolled like water over stones, tonal shifts that defied transcription, consonants that seemed to emerge from the speaker's chest rather than throat. Nakamura had broken Russian diplomatic codes in Manchuria, decoded British naval transmissions at Singapore. He spoke fluent English, conversational German, could parse Mandarin military terminology. But these intercepted messages from Guadalcanal made him feel like a child hearing speech for the first time. In the corner of the room, Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, captured American codebooks spread across his desk, suddenly stood and hurled his pencil against the wall. "It's not a code," he said, his voice breaking. "It's not encryption. They're just talking. They're having conversations we can't understand." The other analysts looked up from their work, seeing their own futility reflected in Yamamoto's exhausted face. What none of them knew was that they were listening to a language that had never been written down by outsiders, whose complexity exceeded any Indo-European tongue, and whose speakers had transformed the vocabulary of their ancestors into an unbreakable military cipher. They were hearing Navajo, and it would remain impenetrable until the war's end. This is the story of how 420 Native Americans created a code that couldn't be broken because it wasn't truly a code at all. It was a living language weaponized, a culture transformed into military intelligence, a tongue that turned battlefield communications from vulnerability into absolute advantage. While Japanese intelligence services had cracked American codes within hours at Pearl Harbor, while German cryptanalysts read Allied messages throughout North Africa, the Pacific Theater witnessed something unprecedented. An encryption system based not on mathematics, but on human memory, not on machines, but on the neural pathways of speakers who thought in verb, subject, object patterns, incomprehensible to anyone raised in the linguistic traditions of Europe or Asia. The transformation began in early 1942, when Philip Johnston, a civil engineer who had grown up on a Navajo reservation as the son of a missionary, approached the Marine Corps with an audacious proposal. Johnston understood what military planners had overlooked. The Navajo language possessed approximately 50 consonant-vowel combinations unknown to Indo-European speakers, tonal variations that changed meaning entirely, and a verb system so complex that a single word could convey what English required a full sentence to express. More critically, it was an unwritten language outside the reservation. No Japanese cryptographer could buy a dictionary. No German intelligence officer could study its grammar. Of the estimated 50,000 Navajo speakers in existence, virtually none lived outside the American Southwest. It was, Johnston argued, a naturally occurring encryption system that required only native speakers to operate. The Marine Corps, desperate after the communications disasters of early Pacific battles where Japanese forces routinely intercepted and decoded American messages, authorized a pilot program. 29 Navajo recruits, many who had never been more than 50 miles from their birthplace, arrived at Camp Pendleton in May 1942. They weren't just learning military communications. They were inventing an entirely new vocabulary. The Navajo language had no words for submarine, fighter plane, or artillery. The Code Talkers would have to create them, building a dictionary that transformed the natural world of the Southwest into the mechanical terminology of modern warfare. Submarine became Beshlo, literally, iron fish. Battleships were Lotso, whales. Dive bombers transformed into Guinea, chicken hawk, while fighters became Dahetihi, hummingbird. The Americas were our mother. Japan was slant eye, and Hitler himself received the designation crazy white man. But the true genius lay deeper than simple substitution. The Code Talkers developed a phonetic alphabet where common English letters were represented by multiple Navajo words. A could be Wallachie, ant, Balasana, apple, or Tsinil, axe. This variation meant that even if an enemy somehow learned one association, the same letter would appear as an entirely different word in the next transmission. The first combat test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. As Marines waded ashore under Japanese fire, 2 Navajo Code Talkers set up their equipment in a shell crater still smoking from naval bombardment. Private First Class Preston Toledo and Private Frank Toledo, cousins despite the shared surname, began transmitting coordinates, enemy positions, and requests for support. In 6 hours of continuous combat, they sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. Communications that would have taken hours to encode and decode using traditional military ciphers flew across the radio waves in real-time conversation. A Japanese forward observation post reported by traditional encoded message might arrive at headquarters 45 minutes after being spotted. By then, the enemy could have repositioned. The same message in Navajo took less than 20 seconds from observation to acknowledgement. The Japanese response was immediate and desperate. Radio intercept units that had successfully tracked American movements across the Pacific suddenly found themselves listening to incomprehensible conversations. Intelligence officers who had studied at American universities, who could parse regional American accents and military slang, sat helpless as these alien syllables flowed through their headphones. They could triangulate the signals, identify the American frequencies, even recognize individual voices over time, but the content remained absolutely opaque. It was as if the Americans had suddenly begun broadcasting from another dimension, where sound itself followed different rules. The Japanese Navy's cryptanalysis section at Rabaul began allocating unprecedented resources to the mystery transmissions by December 1942. Commander Nakamura received authorization to pull linguists from across the Pacific theater, experts in Philippine dialects, Indonesian languages, even scholars of ancient Polynesian. Captain Hideaki Sato, who had spent 3 years at UCLA studying Native American anthropology before the war, was flown in from Singapore. He listened to the recordings for 2 days before submitting a single-page report. These are not code words. This is a natural language, spoken fluently. Origin unknown. Structure unlike any documented Asian, European, or Pacific language family. The implications were catastrophic. A code could be broken with enough time and computing power. A language spoken by an unknown population was mathematically impossible to decrypt without native speakers. On Guadalcanal, Corporal Henry Bahe and Private First Class John V. Good Luck had established their communications post in a captured Japanese bunker, the walls still decorated with rising sun flags and photographs of Emperor Hirohito. As dawn broke on December 8th, 1942, Bahe received an urgent transmission from a forward reconnaissance unit. Japanese forces, approximately battalion strength, moving through the jungle toward American lines. In Navajo, the message flowed like poetry. Kin glo I ka tsebi ze naki dik ahai. Literally, ice position Turkey 2-0 approaching. Within 40 seconds, American artillery had the coordinates. Within 2 minutes, shells were falling on the Japanese column with devastating accuracy. The enemy battalion commander, Major Toshio Yamada, would later write in his captured diary, "The Americans knew our position before we had finished deploying. Their native scouts must be gods of the forest." But there were no native scouts. There was only Chester Nez, 19 years old, crouched in a foxhole with a 30-pound radio set, speaking the language his grandmother had taught him while herding sheep in the checkerboard region of New Mexico, the same language that boarding school teachers had beaten him for using just 5 years earlier. Every word meant lives, Nez would later recall. You'd say, "Besh legai na ki" for anti-tank gun, and 30 seconds later, you'd hear the explosions. You were speaking Navajo, and Japanese soldiers were dying because of words they'd never know existed. The psychological impact on Japanese forces grew exponentially as the campaign progressed. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Masaru Tanaka, captured during the New Georgia campaign in 1943, revealed during interrogation that Japanese commanders had begun attributing supernatural powers to American communications. "We could hear you talking," he said through an interpreter. "Always talking, but the words were inhuman, like wind through rocks. Some of our radio operators refused to continue listening. They said the sounds gave them nightmares." What Tanaka didn't know was that those inhuman sounds were discussions of his unit's movements transmitted by Private Joe Kiyomiya and decoded by Corporal Lloyd Oliver. Two young men from Window Rock, Arizona, who had played together as children among the same red rocks that inspired their language's metaphors. The Code Talkers themselves began developing their own culture within the Marine Corps. They called themselves Dine Bizad Yi Ata Naye Yike, the ones who speak Navajo to help win the war. They created new words daily, expanding their dictionary as military technology evolved. The Sherman tank became Che Dagahi Nailed Saidi, tortoise taking position. Rocket launchers were Tsema Na Ye Di, metal tubes that shoot fire. When the B-29 Superfortress entered the Pacific Theater, they designated it Sidi Mofa Ye Hai, Great Silver Eagle. Each creation had to be memorized perfectly by every code talker. There could be no written records that might be captured. The training regimen intensified as demand for code talkers exceeded supply. At Camp Pendleton's specially constructed communications school, Navajo instructors drilled recruits 16 hours a day. They practiced under simulated combat conditions, explosions detonating nearby, instructors screaming to create panic, sleep deprivation to test accuracy under exhaustion. Private Sam Tso collapsed during a 20-hour continuous transmission exercise, but continued reciting code words while being carried to the medical tent. "The language was in our blood," he explained. "Even unconscious, we could speak it perfectly." By mid-1943, Marine commanders in the Pacific had begun treating code talkers as strategic assets more valuable than artillery pieces. General Alexander Vandegrift issued standing orders that code talkers were never to be deployed without bodyguards, not to protect them from the Japanese, but to prevent capture at all costs. The unspoken implication was clear. Death was preferable to the possibility of the code being compromised. Private First Class Carl Gorman discovered this reality when his bodyguard, Corporal James Mason, pulled him back from advancing with an assault unit. "My orders are to keep you alive or make sure you don't talk," Mason said bluntly. "Either way, you don't get captured." The Japanese response evolved from confusion to desperation to something approaching madness. In May 1943, a special intelligence unit under Colonel Shinji Matsumoto launched Operation Kaze, meaning wind, specifically designed to capture a code talker alive. Japanese soldiers were offered rewards equivalent to a year's salary for bringing in an American wind talker, their term for the mysterious communicators. Elaborate ambushes were planned not to inflict casualties, but to isolate and capture radio operators. When these efforts failed repeatedly, Matsumoto authorized increasingly desperate measures, including suicide squads whose only mission was to penetrate American lines and kidnap communications personnel. The closest call came during the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943. Private First Class Ralph Morgan was separated from his unit during a Japanese night infiltration on Tarawa. For 6 hours, he hid in a shell crater filled with corpses, his radio destroyed, listening to Japanese search parties calling out in broken English. "Native American, we give food, water, no hurt, come talk." Morgan remained silent, even as a Japanese soldier stepped on his hand in the darkness, breaking 2 fingers. He understood that his capture wouldn't just compromise current operations, it would unravel the entire communication advantage the Americans had built across the Pacific. The code's security didn't rely on complex mathematics or encrypted machines. It rested entirely on the shoulders of young men who carried an entire language as a weapon and who understood that their minds contained secrets worth dying to protect. Morgan survived Tarawa, crawling back to American lines at dawn with his broken fingers splinted with rifle cleaning rods. But his near capture sent shockwaves through Marine intelligence. Within weeks, new protocols emerged. Code Talkers would operate in pairs whenever possible, each responsible for the other's security. They received specialized sidearms with explicit instructions. The last bullet was never for the enemy. By February 1944, as American forces prepared for the assault on the Marshall Islands, the Navajo Code had become so integral to operations that Admiral Chester Nimitz declared it the single unbroken code of the war. What he didn't know was that Japanese naval intelligence had just authorized their most extreme attempt yet to crack it. The operation began on Eniwetok Atoll, February 19th, 1944. Captain Yoshihiro Fukuda, a Stanford-educated linguist who had spent years studying Native American cultures at Berkeley, led a specially trained unit with one mission: capture a code talker and break him through any means necessary. Fukuda had listened to over 500 hours of intercepted transmissions, mapping patterns, identifying repeated phrases, building what he believed was the beginning of a decryption matrix. He was wrong. He was mapping the natural rhythm of conversation, not encoded intelligence, but his confidence convinced Imperial headquarters to support the mission with unprecedented resources. The trap was sophisticated. Japanese radio operators began broadcasting false American distress calls, hoping to lure code talkers into rescue attempts. When that failed, they tried psychological warfare, broadcasting recordings of the intercepted Navajo messages back at American positions with subtle alterations, hoping to create confusion or draw corrections that might reveal meaning. Corporal William McCabe, hearing his own voice played back speaking Navajo from Japanese positions, later described it as hearing a ghost of yourself from the enemy's mouth. The tactic failed. The code talkers simply ignored the broadcasts, but it revealed the depth of Japanese desperation. Then came Saipan, June 1944, where the code faced its greatest test. During the pre-invasion bombardment, Private First Class Thomas Begay and Private Floyd Sapati coordinated naval gunfire from a position so far forward they could see Japanese soldiers in their trenches. For 72 consecutive hours, they transmitted target coordinates, damage assessments, and tactical updates without rest. Their Navajo phrases directed the guns of battleships 10 miles offshore onto targets, sometimes just hundreds of yards from their own position. Bi Aldotso, Lani, Aka, Nahash, Chid Tsin Tliti, meaning many big guns, right sparrowhawk dive, and 16-inch shells would arrive with pinpoint accuracy 60 seconds later. Japanese Colonel Takeo Imai, commanding the defense of Saipan's northern sector, wrote in his final report, "The Americans possess a tactical communication system that transcends our understanding of warfare. They speak, and death arrives. We cannot interfere. We cannot deceive. We cannot even comprehend. It is as if they fight with the voices of spirits." Imai didn't live to know he was listening to Samuel Begay and Sidney Bedoni, two 20-year-olds from Shiprock, New Mexico, who had learned their craft herding sheep and were now directing the destruction of an empire. The breaking point came on Peleliu, September 1944. The Japanese had prepared for months, studying every intercepted transmission, building massive archives of recordings. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, still leading the decryption effort from his new headquarters in the Philippines, had assembled a team of 30 linguists and mathematicians. They had tried everything: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, even consulting captured American codebooks for Native American references. Nothing worked. Then, on September 20th, fortune delivered what seemed like a miracle. A wounded code talker, separated from his unit and delirious from blood loss, was captured near the airfield. Private First Class Jimmy King Jr. had taken shrapnel to his abdomen when a mortar round destroyed his foxhole. Semi-conscious, bleeding, he was dragged to a Japanese command bunker where Captain Fukuda waited with a medical team, not to save King's life out of mercy, but to keep him alive long enough to break him. For 18 hours, as King drifted in and out of consciousness, Fukuda tried everything. He spoke to King in English, in Spanish, even attempted phrases from other Native American languages he had studied. He showed King intercepted messages, played recordings, begged him just to explain the structure, the patterns, anything. King, through blood loss and morphine haze, remained silent except for name, rank, and serial number. But in his delirium, he began speaking Navajo, not code, just the rambling memories of childhood, his grandmother's stories, prayers his father had taught him. Fukuda recorded every word, convinced he was finally hearing the code revealed. He rushed the recordings to 3 different translators who had studied North American indigenous languages. None could make sense of it. One, Professor Hiroshi Yamamoto, who had spent a year with Plains tribes before the war, listened for 3 hours before declaring, "This is not Plains language, not Pueblo, not Apache. It's something else entirely. Verbs I've never heard. Tonal patterns that don't exist in any documented language. We would need years of study just to understand its basic structure." The interrogation continued for 3 days. Fukuda, increasingly desperate, tried torture, not the crude physical violence of battlefield interrogation, but sophisticated psychological pressure. He told King that other code talkers had been captured and had already revealed everything. He played him faked recordings of American defeats. He promised medical treatment, food, even repatriation through the Red Cross if King would just explain a single phrase. On the 3rd night, September 23rd, something broke. Not in King, but in Fukuda himself. Corporal Kenji Yamada, standing guard outside the interrogation room, heard it first. A sound he had never heard from a superior officer. Sobbing. When he entered, he found Captain Fukuda on his knees, his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably, while King, barely conscious, continued mumbling in Navajo. "I cannot do it," Fukuda said in Japanese. "I have studied language my entire life. I speak 5 tongues. But this is not a code. It's not a cipher. It's a wall built from sound itself, and we will never climb it." He stood, composed himself, and ordered the medics to properly treat King's wounds. 2 days later, American Marines overran the position during a counterattack. They found King alive, professionally bandaged, with a note in English pinned to his shirt. "This man's language is beyond our comprehension. He has defeated us without speaking a word we understand." The story spread through both armies. American commanders saw it as validation of the program's success. Japanese intelligence saw it as the moment they understood the war was lost. If they couldn't break American communications, they couldn't predict American movements. The code talkers themselves saw it differently. Private First Class King, recovering in a field hospital, told his fellow code talker, Peter MacDonald, "They wanted our words, but our words come from the land, from the holy people, from generations of memory. You can't torture that out of someone. It's not in our heads, it's in our hearts." By October 1944, the Navajo Code had evolved from experimental program to strategic cornerstone. On Leyte Gulf, as the largest naval battle in history unfolded, 26 code talkers coordinated the movements of over 700 American vessels. Private Paul Blatchford, stationed aboard the USS Nashville, transmitted Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's orders to the fleet in phrases that would have seemed like poetry if they weren't directing destruction. "Tota lo tsotse nil na gizi," meaning blue whale axe move, repositioned entire battleship divisions. In one 12-hour period, during the battle's climax, Blatchford and his partner, Corporal Rex processed over 400 operational messages without a single error maintaining communication integrity while Japanese kamikaze planes turned the sky into flame around them. The Japanese response had shifted from attempts at decryption to something approaching supernatural dread. Intercepted Japanese communications from this period, translated after the war, reveal a force psychologically broken by their inability to understand their enemy. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force, wrote in his operational log, "The Americans coordinate as if they share one mind. Our every movement is known before we complete it. Their spirit talkers make warfare impossible." He was listening to Corporal George Kirk and Private Wilson Price, two young men from Lukachukai, Arizona, whose grandmother had taught them the same stories, whose voices now carried across thousands of miles of ocean to orchestrate the destruction of the Imperial Navy. On Iwo Jima, February 1945, the Code would face its most intense operational test. 6 Code Talkers landed with the first assault waves on February 19th, among them Private First Class Merrill Sandoval and Corporal Lloyd Oliver. The volcanic ash mixed with blood to create a paste that clogged equipment, jammed weapons, and turned the beach into what Marine Robert Sherrod called a nightmare of physics. But the radios, protected by their operators' bodies when necessary, kept transmitting. For 36 days, as Marines fought for every yard of volcanic rock, the Code Talkers maintained a continuous stream of communication that connected individual rifle squads to offshore battleships, coordinating a battle of unprecedented complexity. The numbers alone stagger comprehension. During the first 48 hours on Iwo Jima, Code Talkers transmitted over 800 messages. Each had to be perfect. A single misplaced word could bring friendly artillery onto Marine positions. Private First Class Harold Foster, operating from a shell crater near the base of Mount Suribachi, coordinated the fire mission that cleared Japanese positions for the flag raising on February 23rd. As the stars and stripes rose above the mountain, the moment immortalized in photography, Foster was transmitting in Navajo, "Bealdotsolani ne hima nishtala," meaning, "Big gun, our victory complete." The Japanese defenders, listening to these incomprehensible words announcing their defeat, could only wonder what ancient magic the Americans had summoned. The psychological warfare had reversed completely. Where once American commanders feared Japanese code-breaking capabilities, now Japanese forces operated in communicative darkness. Colonel Tadamichi Nishi, the aristocratic tank commander defending Iwo Jima's eastern sector, recorded his frustration in a letter never sent. "We are fighting blind while they see everything. Their native speakers, we know now they are natives of America, though which tribe remains mystery. They mock us with words we will never understand. My signals officer has requested permission to destroy his equipment rather than continue listening to transmissions he cannot comprehend. I have granted it." The Code Talkers themselves began to understand their unique position in history. They were simultaneously invisible and essential. Their fellow Marines often didn't know what they did, yet generals planned entire operations around their availability. Corporal Carl Gorman, one of the original 29, found himself briefing Admiral Nimitz directly before the Okinawa invasion. "The Admiral asked me how we could be sure the code would never be broken," Gorman later recalled. "I told him, 'Sir, you're asking if the Japanese can learn to think like Navajos who have learned to think like Marines. They would need to live our lives, dream our dreams, walk in our footsteps from birth. The code isn't just words, it's who we are.'" Okinawa, April 1945, became the code's final major test. The Japanese had prepared for this battle with fanatic determination, knowing it was the last barrier before the home islands. They had stationed their best remaining cryptanalysts on the island, equipped with the most sophisticated radio intercept technology available. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, evacuated from the Philippines, made one last attempt to break the Navajo Code. He had assembled every recording, every intercepted transmission, every fragment of analysis from 3 years of effort. His team worked in an underground bunker, analyzing transmissions as American forces advanced across the island. On April 18th, As the Battle of Okinawa raged above him, Nakamura made his final report to Imperial General Headquarters. After analyzing 10,000 hours of enemy transmissions in the native language, I must report complete failure. We have identified approximately 400 unique sound patterns, but their meanings remain absolutely opaque. The speakers appear to use multiple words for identical concepts, changing them without pattern. Sentence structure defies all Indo-European or Asian linguistic models. Recommendation: accept that this channel of enemy communication will remain permanently closed to us. The Code Talkers coordinating the Okinawa invasion knew nothing of Nakamura's surrender to their language. Private First Class Joe Kiyomiya and Corporal Thomas Bege operated from a forward position overlooking Shuri Castle, directing naval gunfire that would reduce the ancient fortress to rubble. Their transmissions, Neezoni Lin Ko Klesh Na Ma E, brought destruction with precision that seemed impossible to Japanese defenders. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese defense, wrote his final message before ritual suicide. The enemy speaks with the voice of the wind and strikes with the accuracy of the divine. We cannot fight what we cannot understand. But understanding went both ways. The Code Talkers, products of a culture that had survived its own apocalypse. The long walk, the boarding schools, the systematic attempt to erase their language, now used that same forbidden tongue to help end a war. Private Dan Aki, transmitting from a hill overlooking the East China Sea, found himself crying as he reported in Navajo the mass civilian suicides at the cliffs of Saipan. We were using our sacred language to describe horrors our ancestors never imagined, he later said. Every word was victory and tragedy combined. By July 1945, 375 Navajo Code Talkers had served in combat across the Pacific. They had transmitted hundreds of thousands of messages without a single code breach, coordinated operations from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, and created a linguistic fortress that the combined intelligence services of Imperial Japan could not penetrate. As preparations began for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself, Marine planners calculated they would need at least 800 Code Talkers to coordinate the massive assault. Recruitment accelerated at the Navajo reservation, with teenage boys lying about their age to join what they saw as a warrior tradition extending back generations. But Operation Downfall never came. On August 6, 1945, Private First Class Samuel Tso was encoding a routine logistics message at the 5th Marine Division headquarters on Guam when his commanding officer burst into the communications tent. "Stop all transmissions," the officer ordered. "Something's happened. Something big." Within hours, Tso was transmitting a message unlike any in the code's vocabulary. They had to invent new words on the spot. "Aka na el ini atsa be al do sid da hi," meaning one metal egg, big destruction, Hiroshima. 3 days later, Corporal Chester Nez transmitted the message about Nagasaki, struggling to find Navajo words for atomic fission, for radiation, for destruction that made conventional warfare obsolete. The Code Talkers, who had spent 3 years perfecting a language of war, suddenly found themselves describing its end. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech crackled across radio waves previously filled with Navajo voices. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, who had spent 3 years failing to break the code, was assigned to the Occupation Forces Translation Unit. During the surrender proceedings aboard the USS Missouri, he encountered Marine Corporal Lloyd Oliver, clearly Native American, wearing the Signal Corps insignia. Through an interpreter, Nakamura asked, "Were you one of them, the Wind Talkers?" Oliver simply nodded. Nakamura bowed deeply, held it for a long moment, then said in perfect English, "Your words defeated us more than your bombs. We could rebuild after destruction. We could not fight what we could not hear." The journey home began in September 1945, but for the Code Talkers, it led not to celebration, but to silence. On the transport ship USS Menifee, Private First Class Wilfred Billy received orders that would define the next 23 years of his life. The operation in which you participated is classified indefinitely. You will not discuss your service, your training, or the nature of your communications work with anyone, family, friends, or fellow veterans. Violation of this order is punishable under the Espionage Act. The Navajo men who had used their forbidden language to help win the war were now forbidden to speak about speaking it. They returned to a reservation where using Navajo in government schools was still punished, where their children were being sent to the same boarding schools that had tried to beat the language out of them. Corporal Carl Gorman came home to find his son attending a Bureau of Indian Affairs school where speaking Navajo meant detention. He could not tell his son that the same language the teachers called backward had just helped defeat two empires. Private First Class Joe Keumiya returned to work as a ranch hand. Unable to explain why he sometimes woke screaming Japanese phrases, remnants of his capture and torture on Bataan before becoming a code talker, where Japanese interrogators had tried to use him to break the code, not knowing he spoke a different dialect that made comprehension impossible. The silence broke them in ways combat hadn't. Corporal William McCabe descended into alcoholism, haunted by memories he couldn't share. "We saved thousands of lives," he told his wife, who didn't understand what he meant. "But I can't even tell you how." Private Dan Akey found work in a uranium mine, the same uranium that would fuel the Cold War's atomic arsenal, dying of radiation poisoning in 1964 without ever telling his family about his service. The Code Talkers gathered secretly, meeting in remote parts of the reservation where they could speak freely about their experiences, creating an underground network of memory that preserved what official history ignored. The classification held through Korea, where military planners considered reactivating the program. It held through Vietnam, where Marines desperately needed secure communications in jungle warfare. It held through 2 decades of Code Talkers dying in obscurity, their obituaries mentioning only service in the Pacific. Then, in 1968, as America convulsed with social revolution and Vietnam shattered military certainties, the Department of Defense quietly declassified the Navajo Code Talker program. The decision came without ceremony, buried in administrative documents. But for the surviving Code Talkers, it meant they could finally speak about speaking. The recognition came slowly, reluctantly, as if America struggled to acknowledge that its victory in the Pacific had depended on a people it had tried to culturally exterminate. In 1969, the 4th Marine Division reunion formally honored the Code Talkers for the first time. Carl Gorman, one of the original 29, stood before an audience of his former commanders and explained what they had never fully understood. "You gave us weapons and radios, but we brought something more powerful, a language that survived everything America tried to do to kill it. Every word we transmitted was proof that you cannot destroy a people by destroying their language. The language survives, the people survive, and sometimes that survival saves the world." President Richard Nixon presented the Code Talkers with a Certificate of Appreciation in 1971, not medals, not the congressional recognition other units received, just paper acknowledgement. It would take until 1982 for Congress to designate August 14th as National Code Talkers Day. The original 29 wouldn't receive congressional gold medals until 2001, by which time only 5 survived to accept them. Chester Nez, the last of the original 29, died in 2014, taking with him memories of creating a code that transformed an oppressed language into an unbreakable shield. But the legacy transcends medals and recognition. The Navajo Code remains the only spoken military code never broken by enemy forces, an achievement unmatched in cryptographic history. Military historians calculate that the code shortened the Pacific War by at least 2 years, saving hundreds of thousands of lives, American and Japanese. More profoundly, it reversed a narrative of cultural destruction. The boarding schools that punished Navajo children for speaking their language, the government policies designed to kill the Indian and save the man, had failed so completely that the very language they tried to erase became essential to American victory. Today, the Navajo language faces a different battle against time, assimilation, and the digital age's homogenizing force. Fewer than 170,000 people speak it fluently, most over 50 years old. But in classrooms across the Navajo Nation, children learn the code words their grandfathers created: Besh Lo for submarine, Da Hita Hai for hummingbird fighter planes, Nehima for our victory. They learn that their language once carried secrets across oceans, that their words confused empires, that their grammar defeated armies. They learn what Chester Nez understood in a foxhole on Guadalcanal in 1942, that language is not just communication but identity, not just words but weapons, not just sound but sovereignty. Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Nakamura, who spent 3 years failing to break the code, survived the war to become a professor of linguistics at Tokyo University. He dedicated his career to studying indigenous languages, particularly those of the Americas. In a 1975 academic paper, he wrote, "The Navajo Code Talkers achieved something unique in human history. They transformed their cultural identity into military technology. They proved that the most sophisticated encryption is not mathematical but human. No machine could have done what they did. No algorithm could replicate the complexity of a language born from centuries of oral tradition, shaped by landscape and ceremony, preserved through persecution. They spoke, and empires fell. They whispered, and history changed. We tried to break their code, but you cannot break a language that carries the soul of a people." The last intercepted Japanese intelligence report about the Code Talkers, discovered in archives in 1987, contains a single line that captures the program's essence. The Americans have weaponized memory itself. They had. Every Navajo word transmitted across the Pacific carried within it the long walk of 1,864. The resistance to cultural annihilation, the persistence of a people who refused to disappear. The Code Talkers didn't just transmit military intelligence. They transmitted the indestructibility of indigenous identity, proving that what America had tried to destroy had instead become the key to its salvation. In the end, the greatest encryption was not technical but spiritual. The Japanese couldn't break the code because breaking it required more than linguistics or mathematics. It required living the history, trauma, and triumph of the Navajo people. It required understanding that when Private First Class Harold Foster said "Nehima" as the flag rose over Iwo Jima, he wasn't just saying, "our victory." He was declaring the victory of every Navajo child who had hidden their language from teachers, every elder who had preserved stories despite prohibition, every parent who had whispered forbidden words to their children in darkness. The code worked because it wasn't a code at all. It was a culture converted into sound, a history encoded in syllables, a people's survival transformed into America's salvation.